Good morning and welcome to the next installment in the North Carolina Association of School Administrators Spring and Summer Webinar Series. And today we're focusing on building student resiliency. I'm Catherine Joyce, Executive Director of NCASA, and we are delighted you could be with us today. We are fortunate to have some great presenters who are going to be leading the session for us today. And both are assistant professors at East Carolina in the School of Education, and they are Dr. Karen Jones and Dr. Travis Lewis. And Karen also is a member of the NCASA Board of Directors, representing professors of educational leadership. So thank you both for being with us today. And we have some great partners who are helping to make this session possible. Two of our outstanding Leadership Alliance partners, they are Dreambox and Newsella. So you'll be hearing from them as we go through the morning. But again, thank you all for being with us and making this possible today, focusing on a very timely topic, especially as we have students coming back into our school buildings. Last week, many came into the school building for the first time in almost a year or even a full year since COVID-19 hit our state last March. And we know those students, as they come back into our school buildings, they are bringing experiences from that time away, and they need special support to make sure they can achieve and have a great learning experience. And so it takes special supports to make all that possible for our students. So that is our topic today. Just a few logistics for you as we go through the morning. All of our participants will be in listen-only mode. We do ask, if you have questions for our presenters, if you will put those into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. The chat box is really, if you're having technical difficulties or you want to communicate with our team, or you just want to make a comment, then feel free to use the chat feature. But actual questions you'd like addressed in this webinar today, please use the Q&A. Following the webinar, we will be sending you a follow-up evaluation that we ask you to complete so that we know if the sessions we're providing are helpful and how we can improve in the future, and really make sure that we're providing some content that is most beneficial to you as our members. And in this case, we have some guests today too. So happy to have some of our instructional support personnel, some school psychologists, counselors, and social workers who are with us today. And they certainly are on the front lines in dealing with overcoming issues related to childhood trauma. So happy to have them with us. Okay, so let's move right in. Our session overview for today. So we're going to be starting out with just a word from our first sponsor, and then we're going to have the professors dig into our topic of building student resiliency. Following will be a word by our second partner, and then we're going to wrap up and address all the questions that we've seen in the Q&A that are not addressed as we roll along. Those we'll deal with right at the very end, and then just wrap up from there with just a quick overview of what upcoming sessions you might also want to put on your calendars. So without further ado, let's get started this morning. It is now my pleasure to call on our partner from Newsella, Derek Lovell, who's going to tell you just a bit about their services. And Derek, thank you for your great support of this association and our school leaders.
Yes, ma'am. We're a proud partner of both NCASA along with many of your individual districts. I think it's a very timely topic to talk about social emotional learning and how that funnels into building student resiliency. For those of you that have partnered with Newsella or are considering partnerships for the upcoming year, we do have a lot of age-appropriate leveled content that can help support this topic, and different subcategories such as being kind to yourself, helping students that have dealt with isolation, being a problem solver, taking actions in crisis, along with anti-bias, anti-racist content. So as you think about ABAR content and weaving that into the new social studies standards that North Carolina is due to adopt, we're actually hosting a webinar on April 29th that can kind of talk about both the social emotional learning piece of that, along with adopting new social studies content to support your district. So I'll drop the link in the chat if that interests you or any of your other district leaders to join. And thank you for joining, and thank you for your partnership this year.
Thank you, Derek. Okay, let's now turn it over to our outstanding presenters for the day. I'll call first on Dr. Karen Jones, and she can give you the flow of how they're going to cover the session this morning. So Karen and Travis, up to you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Travis, if you'll go ahead and share your slides and go to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about building student resiliency, but first we want to check in with everyone. So if you'll throw in the chat box, how are you feeling today? Are you blue, green, yellow, or red? And you can do it, send it to all panelists and attendees. You don't have to send it to just your panelists. Just throw in the chat box, if you will, how you're feeling today. Seeing lots of green, a yellow, a blue. Oh, someone's red and yellow. Possibly an art teacher mixing colors. That's okay. Oh, purple and gold. Thank you. All right, so this just gives us a quick check-in, a pulse of where everyone is today. And it's okay if you're not green. Not everyone's green all the time. Last week, my little one, my 16-month-old, was sick, and I was up once an hour at night. And so I was feeling very blue the next day. And that's okay. It just helps people around me to know where I am. So on the next slide, just want to introduce ourselves. I'm Dr. Karen Jones, and I'm in the Department of Educational Leadership at East Carolina University. Before this, I was a teacher. I taught elementary school. I taught special education. I taught English as a second language. I was a behavior specialist. I was a campus administrator, and I was a district administrator. I've worked in rural districts, suburban districts, and a large urban district. So I've seen education from lots of different viewpoints, and I hope to bring that to you today. And I hope to hear from you also, because you have a lot of expertise in these areas. So Dr. Lewis, if you want to introduce yourself.
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. My name is Travis Lewis. I'm an assistant professor at East Carolina University. I am a recovering school counselor. I started my career as a school counselor, moved into administration, ultimately student services director. So I'm a big supporter of our school counselors, our school social workers, our school nurses, our school psychologists. I just can't say enough about the work that they do and how important these specialists are in our buildings. They have a very unique skill set that we need to take advantage of more and make sure that we're utilizing them as best as we can for our students. And so we really are looking forward to chatting with you a little bit today about some of the research that's out there about trauma and resilience, and hopefully how you'll be able to take this back to your schools in your district.
And before we move on, if you could real quick, if you don't mind putting in the chat what your role is in the school or in the district, that helps us know how best to serve our audience today. We have some school counselors. Thank you so much for being here. Some principals, some counselors, assistant principal, social workers, some district level folks.
These are people. Michael and Anita, it's good to see you both. They're a couple of doctoral students in our program.
All right, so we have some people from a wide gamut of different roles, and that helps us know who you are and how you're going to take this back to your school and to your district. So thank you. On the next slide, we're going to start out with some mindful breathing. And so if you're comfortable, go ahead and close your eyes. You can turn off your camera if you'd like. And just take a few deep breaths. Notice any noises you hear around you. Take deep breaths, filling your belly. And if you have room or space on the next inhale, raise your arms up over your head as you inhale. Stretch, and then lower your arms on the exhale. Raise your arms on the inhale. Lower your arms on the exhale. You can do this 2 more times. Notice any sounds in your space. And you can open your eyes and turn your camera on when you're ready. Just take a moment to notice how you're feeling right now. Hopefully you're feeling a little more calm, a little more relaxed. Wouldn't it be nice to have a faculty meeting where everyone feels this way? Wouldn't it be nice to have a classroom where students feel this way? It took less than 60 seconds of what we did there. And so it doesn't cut into instructional time. And if it gets kids socially, emotionally, mentally ready, the blood is flowing in the right parts of their brain, then they're better able to pay attention. And so we know that mindful breathing, as it says there, increases attention, increases emotional self-regulation, and increases metacognitive processes. And there's some citations there that support this research behind breathing. So thank you so much, and we'll go on to our learning objectives for today. So we hope that you'll gain an understanding of adverse childhood experiences, which are ACEs, and their consequences, learn strategies to build resilient students, and then learn how to apply these strategies for students and staff returning after extended remote learning. So we know for a lot of you, you may have students back in the building who have not been back in the building in 12 months. Some students are coming in shifts. Some students, hopefully we'll have a lot of students in the fall. And I know you also have summer programs that you're going to be managing as well. So we have students coming in lots of different ways that we're going to talk about how to help that. And I will turn it over to Dr. Lewis.
So since we have a lot of counselors and social workers and psychologists, I'm sure many of you have heard about ACEs. I'm really excited to see so many principals and district administrators here, because that tells me that we've got the right people in the right places in our schools throughout our state, people who care about kids. And if you're here today and you're wanting to address trauma and resilience, then I know you've got the right heart for the job. And so as we talk about ACEs, many of you have heard about this, so we're going to give kind of a quick, just kind of refresher about this. So adverse childhood experiences, those experiences that can set kids back, right? And we found out through a study that we'll share a little more about with you back in the 90s, that these adverse childhood experiences have tremendous impact physically, emotionally, and obviously on students' school performance. Now, the original ACE study looked at these 10 particular adverse childhood experiences: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect that's physical and emotional, and then just household dysfunction generally. So mental illness in the household, an incarcerated relative, the mother was treated violently, domestic violence situation in the home, substance abuse, and even divorce. Now, while those were the 10 original ACEs, because this was, again, 20 some years ago when this original study was, we've learned since then that there's so many other types of trauma that can fall into the category of adverse childhood experiences. And so when we're thinking about that, natural disasters, we're here in Eastern North Carolina, inevitably a lot of communities are impacted by hurricanes. We've seen, students have been displaced, entire schools displaced for extended periods of time. That has an impact on our kids. It has an impact on us as faculty and staff. And so that impact can be long lasting. Community violence, racial injustice and discrimination, like what we're seeing throughout our nation right now, homelessness, medical trauma, chronic illness. Many of us work with kids who are undergoing chemotherapy and the trauma that toll that it takes on them. Our pandemic, right? And the effects of that. Many of our kids are having a really tough time as a result. And so when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, think of these original 10 ACEs, but then also think of the other types of trauma that are out there. It's not exclusive to just these 10. But that first ACE study It was conducted by ANDA and Kaiser Permanente, and they conducted this in California in the mid-90s. And they had 17,000 participants. And the questionnaire included just 10 questions about 10 different ACEs. And what they found were 26% of those, that 17,000, a lot of folks here, reported at least one adverse childhood experience that they had endured. And then all the way up to 4+ ACEs, 12%. That's phenomenal that there was that many people who've experienced that much adverse childhood experience. And so also what we found out of that research was that these adverse childhood experiences can have these long-lasting negative health effects, right? So people with 6 or more ACEs can die 20 years earlier than the rest of us. An eighth of the population has more than 4 ACEs. And so this is beyond even the sample from the California study. So those with 4 more ACEs, they're 3 times more likely to have lung disease, 14 times more likely to have the number of suicide attempts, more likely to be depressed, have liver disease, to abuse drugs. And so when we're talking about the impact on our lifespan, it's seriously affected. Ultimately, they found that 67% of the population has at least 1 ACE. So when we start looking across the country, right, and saying, okay, well, how do we compare in that regard? Some of the populations that we really need to pay attention to here in the South Atlantic, where we are, so in North Carolina, when we're talking about our Black non-Hispanic students, 29% have experienced at least 1 ACE. And then our Hispanic students, at least 27%. So all of our population is 1 ACE is too many. But when we start looking at those numbers, it's glaring that there's a tremendous need in this part of the country. So what effect does these adverse childhood experiences, does trauma have on the brain? So trauma results in toxic stress, right? So constantly our body's being challenged by the effects of trauma. And so we kick into this fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? Depending, each of us is kind of unique in how we do that. And it affects our attention, our memory, our executive functioning, just the things that we do day in. How organized are we? How do we plan? How do we self-regulate? All of that can be tossed asunder if we're constantly experiencing this toxic stress from trauma. An example that we like to give is a roller coaster. Some of you may really enjoy getting on a roller coaster. I, however, can't stand it. My heart starts racing. I start to panic a little bit. I try to play it cool in front of my kids, right? Like, oh, how about this? I'm going to go get all of you ice cream so that when you're done with the roller coaster, I'll be standing there and I'll be a hero. When in fact, I'm a coward, right? I don't want to get on that roller coaster. However, the rest of you may really enjoy the roller coaster and the effect that comes after it, and you feel this euphoria and you're excited. It's a very different effect. The same with other types of trauma throughout your life. What for some of us may cause us to freeze, for others of us may respond very differently. We may fight, or we may handle it well if we're resilient. I was just reading a story about 2 young women who were eating outdoors and at a restaurant, and a car jumped the curb and nearly hit them. And one of them jumped out of the way and kind of yelled and pushed the table towards the car. The other one froze and she was hit by the car. Okay. 2 people, same situation, very different responses. It's the same with toxic stress. So these are emotional reactions, right? So we have different responses to the trauma. An example I like to give, and even each of us individually, depending on the situation as well. So many years ago, when I was first starting as a school counselor, part of the emergency action plan for one of our students who was pregnant was, hey, if she goes into labor, I'm supposed to respond. School counselor, we get called to do so many different things that don't really fall into our wheelhouse necessarily, but I was supposed to help respond. And in the moment, as the plan was being developed, sure, cool, I can do that. Well, guess what? All of a sudden, one day, I hear the teacher running up the hall saying that she's going into labor. I panicked. I froze, right? I actually went and physically hid in the bathroom that was adjoining my office, waiting for rescue to get there. Because in that moment, I just didn't know what I would do or how I would react. Now, fast forward several months later, and in the community that I was serving as a school counselor, we actually had an explosion at a chemical plant that was not far from the school. It was a pharmaceutical plant, actually. And it blew the doors open to the school. The whole school shook. This was shortly after 9/11. So my response then was not to freeze, But instead it was to jump up. I ran out of the building. I was ready to take on, in my mind, Al Qaeda or whoever was trying to bother my students, right? Very different response. So in one instance, right, we're able to react, we're prepared, we kick into that fight mode. Another situation, we might kick into that freeze mode. It just really depends. So now you know my kryptonite is women in labor and also snakes, just as an aside. But those reactions, it's unique for each one of us. And it's the same for our kids. So when they're experiencing trauma, their reactions, some kids, as we'll talk about in a bit, they might be very withdrawn. Other kids want to talk about their trauma all the time, what they experienced. It's almost like they just can't let go of it. And so we can't just say, all right, one size fits all necessarily. So what might this look like in our kids when we're seeing, okay, what's trauma look like in elementary students, for instance? Well, for them, it might be somatic complaints, right? My stomach hurts, headache. You know, they can't really necessarily verbally explain that why they're feeling this way. They may not really understand it, but it could be the result of the trauma and the toxic stress that comes from that. And imagine the fear every day if they're afraid of going home because there's a domestic violence situation going on. It starts to make them sick, especially maybe as the day starts to get longer, gets closer to the end of the day. What if they're being bullied, right? And they're fearful for their lives, and every day they're experiencing that. And so whenever it comes close to the time that they might interact with said bully, they're starting to feel sick. It could be a sudden change in just all of a sudden they become really angry and it's inconsistent, or maybe they're really anxious or fearful about their safety. They're really clingy to the teacher or to a peer. Okay, that could be the result of trauma. That's their response. Increases in absences, right? Could be a situation going on at home. It could be something they're afraid of at school. So keeping that in mind, trying to dig a little deeper. Our social workers do a really great job in trying to figure that out a lot of times. Why is this kid missing school? Is it something that is outside of their control? Is it something that's a response to trauma? So difficulty with attention, concentration, if you're constantly thinking about what's going to happen when you go home, it's awfully hard for you to focus on what's going on right there in front of you in the classroom. A sudden decrease in academic performance, right? So students experience trauma, they're starting to have those effects, the toxic stress is starting to kick in, and all of a sudden a student that might have been performing really well is distracted. They're unable to focus on school. They're starting to trail off really quick. And then also maybe they have a preoccupation with talking about it. Like I mentioned earlier, some kids, you know what, that's how they're processing it. They're talking about it all the time until they can get their head wrapped around it and they can adapt and cope. And so that's where they're trying to work it through, make sense of what they're experiencing, how they're feeling. So that's our elementary kids. What about middle and high school kids? It's a little different for some of them. They might have a change in worldview. All of a sudden, the world is an unsafe place. It's really hard for them to develop those trusting relationships. And you may see that in school, right? They're standoffish. They're kind of difficult to interact with in some ways. And that worldview has completely shifted as a result of the trauma that they've experienced. Maybe they're really self-conscious about how they're feeling, right? Maybe they're shameful. They feel guilty. They're embarrassed, right? I remember, and I see Annette Glass in the chat. She remembers that day. Thanks for laughing. Annette actually saved the day many times. She was a former school counselor who was there actually that time when I was dealing with that particular day I was mentioning. But in that instance, I was feeling a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. I didn't help out my student that way. Well, imagine experiencing trauma and you're starting to just really have a tough time being able to process, you know what, why am I responding this way? I should do more. I should be more resilient. They start to take it upon themselves. And then they're feeling that shame and that guilt instead of understanding that it's something that's really out of their control. Increase in self-destructive or risky behavior, right? So the world's an unsafe place, like we mentioned earlier. So the heck with it. Might as well go ahead and use substances to help kind of cope with that trauma, or maybe self-harm so that I can feel physical pain to match this emotional pain that I have inside. And just like with the younger kids, difficulty with attention and concentration, changes in their relationships. They might be more hostile or standoffish, more aggressive. The academic performance decreases, increase in absences, and more behavioral difficulties. So whenever we start seeing these things, we're not saying, okay, automatically you need to jump to trauma, but it's one of the things that you need to explore and consider that might be the reason why you're seeing some of these behaviors.
And
Now,
thinking about, oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. And just as a lead into this, Dr. Jones, so as we think about all those types of traumas, there's an anti-ACE, right? Like the antidote to help overcome that. And so that's where I want to turn it over to Dr. Jones to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. And I also want to say, think about the adults in your building. How are they manifesting this stress? Is it the preoccupation with talking about things? Are they very concerned about safety protocols and making sure everyone's 6 feet apart and everyone's wearing their masks? Are they becoming overly fixated on that? Are they, in themselves turning to more drinking in the evenings or on the weekends to cope with things? Are they changing? Is there a change in their relationship with others? Are they more agitated when dealing with administration or peers than they used to be? So thinking about adults in your building are going through this as well. And also when Dr. Lewis talked about the ACEs, we think about the ACEs as something that's a lot of times something that's at home. Well, a lot of these kids have been at home for a long time, for every hour of every day for a long time. And so if you're dealing with a domestic abuse situation, you didn't have the escape of going to school for a few hours. You've been with it all day, every day. If you have a parent with substance abuse issues or a caregiver with substance abuse issues, again, you've been with it all day, every day, and that can amplify what it looks like. But luckily, we know there's neuroplasticity. We know that the brain can form and reorganize its synaptic connections, that the brain can make new pathways. But I would like to say that it does take a little while to make a new pathway. And I like to think about, I like analogies, and I like to go hiking. And so I think of hiking. And when you're on a trail, it's easy. That's the trail that you normally go down. It's very easy. You get from one place to the other. You know where you're going. It's an easy route to take. You can take a new trail, but it's a little bit uncomfortable. You're going to get stickers in your shoes and in your socks and in your legs. You're going to get more bug bites. It's going to be uncomfortable, but the more times you do the new trail, it gets worn down and it becomes the way that you can normally go. So when you're making new connections in the brain, you have to practice over and over and over again to wear down and create that new pathway so that it becomes automatic. I would love to go to the gym one time and be ready for bathing suit season. That would be awesome if I could just go once. But my muscles and my body need a little bit more practice than that. So we need to think about, how you're forming habits and how, building resilient strategies is a habit that you have to practice over and over again. So next, what is resilience? And it's the ability of a child or an adult to recover and show early and effective adaptation after a potentially traumatic event. And again, we say potentially traumatic because not everyone reacts to this, like Dr. Lewis said, to relax to things the same way. Just like not everyone reacts to a roller coaster the same way, not everyone's going to react to COVID the same way. We want resilient students who respond with minimal distress or impact on their daily functioning. Again, minimal distress. We're not going to take away their distress. They're still going to have stress. That's the thing that is going to happen. But how quickly do you bounce back from it? So that, like it says, it creates a temporary dip in the ability to cope, but then an effective early return to the child's usual functioning, and focus on and promoting of the child's natural strength. So we're looking at assets, not deficits. And so thinking about, and what are some of the hard things and stressors? And again, these are more for adults, not having, not being able to pay bills, not having enough food to eat, violence, health problems, housing that does not feel safe. But how does that affect students as well? Students may not, depending on the age of the student, may not know that there's not enough money to pay bills, but they know the stress and the anxiety of the adults around them. Then you have the good things and the resources on the right, people you can count on, dependable transportation, safe housing, a doctor you trust, having enough money. And then there are things about you in the middle, which are your genetics, your DNA, your resiliency, your ACE score, your life story, your personality. So resiliency is when the scale tips towards the good, even when there are hard things. So again, this is not like unicorns and rainbows. Not everything is going to be happy all the time, but how quickly can you bounce back? How quickly can you let yourself feel that and then be more productive with those feelings? And so what are some factors of resilience? Social competence, optimism, having a purpose, having a positive attachment to family, school, and learning. So we know, a lot of you know, particularly our school counselors, the attachment to one adult in the building can make such a difference, whether it's a teacher or a custodian or a secretary or admin assistant. If they have an attachment to one person in the building, they're much more likely to come to school and feel successful. Do the students and adults have problem-solving skills, an effective coping style, and a positive self-image? So those are all things that are factors in how resilient someone will be. And again, we're talking about students, but think about adults. You know, how do our adults in your building measuring up with this as well? So self-regulation is a skill. Managing emotions, managing thoughts, managing behavior. So in the chat box, how does your school provide explicit instruction on these skills? What does your school do to help students in these areas? Thank you, Donna. A second step, yes. We're both educators. We have plenty of think time. We can give you plenty of think time. Anything else that you're doing to explicitly teach these skills? Thank you. Zones of regulation. Well, maybe people are not explicitly teaching these skills. Oh, here comes some things, or they're doing multiple things at once, and this is just on in the background. That happens too. Thank you. You know, SEL, morning check-ins, morning meetings, PBIS, absolutely. So thinking about teaching of this as an explicit skill, we think about, I think about when you teach someone how to tie their shoes, you don't just show them once. You don't just show them and you say, okay, now go forth and tie your shoes. Good luck to you. But you have to teach them over and over again. And you may have to hand over hand help them. And you're going to have to buy them some Velcro shoes for a couple weeks because you're frustrated with it. And then you come back and you try the tying the shoes again. But it takes a long time to teach that. And it's an explicit skill you have to teach. And we teach multiplication in elementary school. And we teach it, we break down the skill and we use manipulatives and we use visuals and we break it down and we practice it over and over and over again, because we don't expect that a student comes to us knowing how to multiply or knowing how to tie their shoes or knowing how to do a chemistry equation. But do we expect that students can calm down? Have you ever heard a teacher or an adult say, why can't they just calm down? Well, first of all, that adult doesn't sound very calm. Second of all, we don't know who taught them how to calm down. Who taught them how to problem solve? Who taught them positive self-talk? Who taught them these things? There's always, well, maybe they should have learned it at home. Well, maybe they learned a version of it at home, but that may not be the most productive version that we want to see in our schools and in our adults moving forward. So thinking about how are we explicitly teaching these things? We don't expect a kid to know how to multiply. We don't expect a kid to know how to tie their shoes. We can't expect them to know how to calm themselves down or self-regulate. We have to teach it as a skill. We talk about lifelong learners. We talk about 21st century skills. I want adults in my life who know how to do these things. I want these as my neighbors, as my doctors, as my coworkers. So what we're going to do is talk about how we teach students to identify, how we build resilience is we want to teach them how to identify stressors, identify what they normally do when presented with a stressor, brainstorm an alternative way to respond, and apply and maintain coping skills. And we're talking about students, but think about adults. Do the adults in your building know how to do these things? And so we'll focus on that a little bit more. So the first thing is to teach students to identify stressors. And so on the next slide, we want to have students identify things that make them sad, upset, stressed, and it helps when adults model this as well. So thinking about how a teacher could do this in a classroom, how a counselor could do this as part of a counseling lesson, how you could do this at a faculty or staff meeting with all the adults in your building. Again, it doesn't have to be a public list. It can be something that they write down. It can be something that they draw pictures of if they're younger students, but things that upset them and make them stressed or sad. And again, adults can model this. So again, thinking about for our principals and assistant principals, could you do this in a faculty meeting? Could you model and have teachers, write down things that make them upset or stressed? So once they've identified their list of things that are stressors for them, Then we want them to next identify what they normally do when presented with the stressors. And we want them to list their actions or reactions next to each stressor. So maybe a stressor is something that, doing homework is a stressor, or fighting with my sister, or getting on the bus, or different things are stressors. What do they normally do? And again, have the adults do it as well. What are things they normally do when faced with the stress? And then have them rate their responses from very helpful or not at all helpful. Because sometimes our response to stress might not be so bad. It might be something that's actually helpful. Maybe I already know to take a deep breath or to step away from the situation for a few moments. But sometimes our reactions are not very helpful. So we identify our stressors, we identify our reactions, we identify if they're helpful or not. Then next, we brainstorm alternative ways to respond. And this is again where the things that you're teaching in your second step curriculum and your SEL framework, through different curriculums that you're using, your zones of regulation, have them think about these coping skills and how they're going to match them up with each of these different stressors and different unproductive behaviors of responses. Have the whole group list of productive strategies, and then students identify a short list that might work for them. And they match them, like I said, to what is a not very helpful behavior. It's important to have students match their own. I have come up with their own ideas of what would be some positive things that they want to try. We as the adults don't want to tell them, you need to breathe. Well, maybe that's not the best thing for them. Maybe they want to stretch. Maybe they want to step outside for a moment. We don't want to tell them what's going to work for them. We want them to try it. We want them to try it, and we want them to see how it works. Because if we tell them to do something and it doesn't work for them, now they're going to blame us. Now they're going to say, well, you told me to breathe and it didn't work for me, and it didn't work, and I still got in a fight, and now they don't trust you. You're damaging that relationship with them. Let them try things that you've brainstormed, try from different productive things and see what works for them. So next, we want them to apply and maintain these coping skills. So, we want them to then a day or two or three or a week later, build time for students or adults to reflect on how this new coping strategy has worked. If it did not work for them, what could they try now? So we have this list that we've brainstormed, and maybe we have it in the classroom, maybe we have it in the counselor's office, maybe we have it again, maybe we did it at a faculty meeting. Okay, so that strategy didn't work for me. What else can I try next time? And again, adults can suggest strategies, but the choice should be the students. Let them take some ownership. Sometimes they don't have control of a whole lot of things going on right now. And so giving them a choice of, I want to breathe or I want to take a time out, that's a great thing to let them choose. Again, we're not letting them choose something harmful. We're letting them have some control over positive behaviors that they want to choose. It's like when you're dealing with a little kid and you say, do you want to wear your coat or do you want to carry your coat? Because you're taking the coat, but you can wear it or you can carry it. I will give you choices. I will give you controlled choices. So we're helping kids, we're brainstorming a list of positive behaviors, positive reactions, and then we're letting them have some choice.
And Dr. Jones, if I could interject, Michael mentioned in the text box sometimes being worried about whether or not, strategies are culturally responsive. And that's where, getting back to what Dr. Jones was saying, letting the students have some control over their choices there and to try some things out, what works for them, rather than, what necessarily works for me, right? As a white male, for instance. All right, what works for me may not work for someone else. And so then kind of working through that brainstorming, that should be able to help address exactly that concern.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And like I said, some of you have some great curriculums and some great resources you're using. So take the strategies that you're teaching in those and use those, help students apply them more specifically, being very explicit about, this is my stressor, this is what I normally do, this is what I'm going to try it for a couple days or a week, and then come back and check in and see how it's working. That's an important part. You've got to come back and check in and see how it's working. If it is working, great, keep doing what you're doing. If it's not, have the students brainstorm with each other. I tried this, I tried that. Again, do it with adults in your building as well. Don't forget about the adults at your faculty meetings or your department meetings or your PLC meetings if a faculty meeting is too large, because some high schools, a faculty meeting can be a bit overwhelming. Are there smaller ways that you can break this down for the adults? So thinking about, where is your school? Is your school trauma informed? trauma sensitive, or trauma skilled. So trauma informed would be a school where staff have an understanding of trauma and awareness of the impact it can have across the school setting and the students. A trauma sensitive school is where students feel safe, welcome, and supported. And you're addressing trauma on a school-wide basis as the center of your educational mission. And then there's trauma skilled. If you're trauma informed and you have trauma skills, and a school that develops resilience and fosters students of trauma impacted youth. So thinking about where you fall in that continuum. And it's a continuum. And sometimes you might be starting out as trauma informed, but can you move to being more trauma sensitive? Can you move to being more trauma skilled? And how much of is this at a forefront for your education? So next, Dr. Lewis, you want to talk about trauma sensitive schools?
Sure. And so for trauma sensitive schools that are, aspiring to become trauma skilled, right? Hopefully many of our schools are trauma informed already, but if not, that's where you can step in. Just the information we're sharing with you today, taking this back and helping convey that to your faculty, that's a good step to becoming trauma informed. Also, beyond that, then becoming trauma sensitive, starting to put into effect some things that are actually going to be able to take into account the trauma that our students are experiencing. Trauma skilled is kind of the highest peak we can kind of aspire to. And so while we all want to do that, at this point, most of us are looking at, all right, what can we do to become trauma sensitive? And so what research shows about trauma sensitive schools, and you can use this to help leverage moving in this direction for the naysayers that might be out there or saying, I've heard before, we're pandering to the kids, we're making them soft by taking into account. No, we're not. No, we're not. We're actually, this is skill development, right? This is what we're about. We're about teaching. And so when we're talking about trauma sensitive schools, the evidence that you can use to help leverage becoming trauma sensitive is it decreases students' depressive symptoms. Okay, so we're addressing depression. Potentially for some students that could have an impact on their academic performance, behavioral outcomes. One of the things that have been found is suspension rates improve by 30 to 90%. How many of you, especially you administrators, are spending an inordinate amount of time addressing behavior issues during a regular school year? I know in a pandemic, it's a little different, trying to address those issues. What can we do to improve? Trying to brainstorm, come up with strategies. What are we going to do differently? Well, right here is one. It doesn't cost much at all to become a trauma sensitive school. It's more of a shift in mindset. And I'll talk about that in a second. Office referral rates decreasing, incidents of physical aggression decreasing by 43%, right? Who wouldn't love to cut fights in half at your school? And then suspension rates over a 5-year period. So gradually becoming trauma sensitive, we put that in place, and now we're moving more towards becoming trauma skilled, right? We're really becoming very comfortable as a building. It's part of our culture. Suspension rates down by 95%. Just think about that. All right, if suspension rates are down by 95%, that means kids are in the building more. So we're going to see an increase in self-esteem, right? They're functioning. They know what they're supposed to be doing. They feel supported. Their academic outcomes are going to come about, right? 28% more with their ability to learn. Well, think about it. We talked earlier about some of the warning signs for trauma and toxic stress. So kids are distracted, and maybe their attendance has gone down. All of those things, we're counteracting that. So students' time on task increases by over a quarter, attendance rates up by a third, test score performance increases, all these things. We're spending a ridiculous amount of money on remediation, right? Different programs, additional staff. We're wanting to achieve these same outcomes, but here's another way that we could come about this. Instead of doing the same thing over and over again with the same results, let's tackle it a different way, a student-centered approach. So what can we really do as a school? Well, we can increase awareness. Like we said, that's a starting point, taking this information back. Dr. Jones and I are more than happy to do that. We'll share our information at the end. Whatever else we can do to assist you in this regard, we would love to. Recognizing the potential effects of trauma on attendance, grades, test scores, classroom behavior. So saying, all right, look, let's collect all of this data. And instead of approaching it the same way we always have, let's look at it through this trauma sensitive lens. All right, what are some things that we can do to be able to improve student attendance by making the place that students are coming to every day a place where they want to be, where their self-confidence is higher, where they feel safe. Then being able to identify students who are in need of help due to trauma. Some of the things that we were talking about before aren't necessarily warning signs of trauma every single time, but what can we do to assess? What's a system that we can put in place in our school to be able to monitor and determine whether or not that's something that's impacting some of our kids? Being able to respond to the needs of our traumatized students. I get really disappointed when I see schools that are utilizing their student services staff in all the wrong ways. Our counselors, our social workers, our nurses, our psychologists, they're really great to be able to help brainstorm and think through this. So principals, I'm telling you, gather that group of people, they're specially trained, and say, all right, what can we do to respond to the needs of our traumatized students for our building? What specifically works for us and our climate, our culture? Then paying attention to the impact of policy issues, right? What impact does, for instance, a zero tolerance policy have for trauma impacted students? Probably not a very good one. Is that really what we're trying to achieve here? And then recognizing the importance of self-care. We've been talking about this throughout. Your folks are worn out, right? You, your colleagues, everyone's exhausted. Like, our response to this pandemic has just taken a lot out of us. Our teachers, I have no idea how they're coping with this, because especially some of them who are having to teach on a hybrid basis, where they're teaching face-to-face and virtually at the same time. We're asking more and more people who've already, their vessel's empty, right? Like, we've taken everything out of it. And so what can we do to try and help overcome that? Especially some of you, if you're here, you probably really care about your students. Well, then compassion fatigue is going to kick in, right? So what are we doing to kind of balance that work and life so that we can give our very best when we are at school and we can be engaged and not burn out? I particularly worry about a lot of our young professionals as well, who might just jump in head first, and are people checking in on them? Are they okay? Many of us can think back to when we first started out and how idealistic we were, and sometimes that could get out of control. And so what are we doing to help make sure that they're managing their secondary traumatic stress?
And I just want to jump in real quick. When you look at the bullet that's second to the bottom about policy issues, thinking about your discipline policies, we know, and we showed you earlier, that one of the reactions that students may have to trauma and stress is becoming agitated, becoming aggressive. So every time a student talks back to a teacher, does it end up in a suspension? That policy is hurting students, and it's kicking students out of the building who probably need to be in the building in a safer place and need to learn different coping strategies. Just sending them away is not helping them deal with their stress, and it's not helping them, develop problem-solving skills and develop appropriate strategies. So thinking about policy issues around discipline is very important when dealing with these things, because especially your discretionary discipline, like rude to adult, disrespectful, those discretionary issues, if the adults in the building have a shift in mindset, then we can make sure we're meeting students where they are, and we're addressing the real root of the issue, which may be the trauma that they're dealing with from COVID or from other life experiences. So sorry, Dr. Lewis, thank you.
No, thank you for saying that. Yeah, we're wanting to mitigate, not escalate, right? And so that's when we're looking at our policies, being able to say, disobedient, disruptive, discourteous, the D ones, right? Those are always really subjective. What if we come at those from a trauma-informed approach, a trauma-sensitive approach? Would they look very differently? So Dr. Jones just mentioned that shift in mindset, right? And some of this can start with our language, just as simple as modeling the right language. Instead of saying a student is impulsive and putting a label on them, instead, let's talk about the skill deficit there and how we need to try and improve that. We need to teach that. So instead of impulsive, we're talking about they have difficulty regulating emotions. Okay. Impulsive, all right, how do I improve or teach that, right? But if you tell me they have difficulty regulating emotions, okay, that's something we can work with. If you say they're aggressive or they're defiant, again, we're labeling, right? Trying to say, oh, that's just the way they are, and we walk away from it. No, we still have a responsibility. We're trying to teach. We're trying to prepare citizens for the real world. These are going to be your doctors, your lawyers, your neighbors, the people who are taking care of us someday, right? We can't just put a label on them and walk away. We've got to help them become the very best they can be. And so instead of saying aggressive or defiant, well, what can we control? What can we do? Oh, their trauma response is triggered. They're trying to find safety. How can we help them with that? They're withdrawn or unmotivated. Well, another way of saying that is they're afraid or they're overwhelmed, right? They're overreacting. They're dramatic. Maybe they're seeking to get their needs met. All right. Again, these aren't excusing the behavior. It's just trying to approach them from a different way of saying, okay, here's a skill deficit that we need to address. And then we say, oh, they have ADHD. Well, maybe they're just lacking some of the necessary skills. So instead of just planting these labels on kids, let's look at the language that we use and how we view these particular issues. So Dr. Jones, you talk about school strategies?
Yeah, so in some of you, it sounds like have some of these things already in place, a calm down area, a peace corner, it might be called. And again, it's not a place for someone to escape and get out of doing work. It's giving them a place to step away for a moment, step away and calm themselves down using grounding exercises and mindfulness, incorporating social emotional learning into the curriculum, thinking about empathy, coping. And also thinking about when you're looking at social emotional learning in the curriculum, again, it's something that you're teaching as an explicit skill, but then how do you identify that? Can you identify those things in literature passages? Can you identify those things when you're reading about historical events? How can you identify, tying this language into the way we do business at the school? Again, looking at behaviors from a trauma-focused lens. So we're not letting students get away with things. We're looking at what can we address, like Dr. Lewis said, how can we actually address this? And I think about, you don't have, if you say that's a bad kid, well, that's who they are. That's inherent. They're bad. They made bad choices. That's different. There's some control. If they made bad choices this time, then they can make better choices next time. So reframing it so that it's not a bad kid, it's a bad choice. Hitting your friend, bad choice. Biting your friend, bad choice. But you know what? You can make a better choice next time. Giving time and space to calm down before providing consequences with respect. We know that when a child is in fight, flight, or freeze, they're in their animal brain, and all the blood in their brain is not in the part of their brain where they can make rational choices. It is not good to have a conversation with a child about their behavior when they are in an agitated state. But also pay attention to your own feelings when dealing with misbehavior or conflict. If you see yourself starting to escalate when the student is escalating, what are your strategies for calming down? What are your strategies for tapping in and tapping out with other adults in your building? Have you, I'm sure as counselors and administrators, you've walked into a room and you've seen that the teacher is just as agitated as the student by the time they call you. Do you need to let that teacher step out of the room and give them a chance to take a few breaths, to get out, to give them some space, because they are agitated as well and they may be causing more harm than good? So we want to watch a little video clip about a school that is doing this. And then after the video clip, we're going to talk specifically about the return to school after COVID-19 and what all of these things might look like in your building.
We understand the effects of adverse childhood experiences nationally. This is not an issue that is just isolated to my demographic at my school.
You're gonna do great, aren't you? Okay, nice work.
We understand what it does to them now and potentially in the future. We're right off of downtown Nashville, and we're in the midst of some serious transformation and gentrification. And so a lot of our students are being displaced. We have students who are currently experiencing some serious tragedy in their lives, and we know their stories, and we take a proactive approach here to make sure their needs are being met.
Doing all right today?
The old approach was you're at school, you need to be at school and play school, and it was compliance driven. But the trauma approach is taking a completely different lens. They have to feel safe, they have to feel nurtured, and they have to feel supported. When kids walk through the door, they don't leave everything that has happened at the door. They're still developing emotionally, they're still developing cognitively, and we want to give them the ability to do that in a safe environment that is school. To be quite frank, this transformation is more about adults than it is kids.
You had a perfect day?
It's about giving the teachers the understanding and support to be able to meet the needs of the kids on a basic level.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9.
There was a big mind shift, for me especially. My students might have had a bad day, something happened at home, no one was home last night. You can't just be like, come in and do math now. So when they know they can trust you and they talk to you, their academics start to blossom.
One of the most transformative strategies is getting someone who is trained in understanding students' mental health needs.
I was brought in as a part of the district initiative to increase the awareness and knowledge of ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. Class been okay?
Yep.
So coming in and identifying different trauma-informed practices that we can implement here in the school.
One of the foundational programs that we're utilizing is the Leader in Me. A lot of people are very familiar with the 7 habits of highly effective people for kids. And so here we foundationally teach our kids the 7 habits.
You'll see the posters around the school and you'll see the kids, they know all of the 7 habits and they will spout them out to you.
The 7 habits has helped me because I had to put first things first. I had to make sure that I was getting good grades and not starting drama with any kids.
We also build the students' capacity to develop their leadership skills by giving them a class in leadership. It's part of our specials rotations. Kindergarten through 4th grade are part of the Leader in Me curriculum.
Be proactive, be proactive.
We share this common language. It is so amazing with putting everybody on the same page. Building that positive school culture and an environment where everyone feels empowered to be successful.
We now have students leading other students in different activities throughout the building.
Who wants to go first?
And we value that.
Good morning, leaders. The time is 8 o'clock.
Traditionally, in most schools, you've got the iridescent lighting that burns our eyeballs like laser beams. But here we have teachers use a lot of low lighting. Some of our rooms have calming colors, utilizing color as a strategy. We also use essential oil diffusers with just understanding that your body is sensory. We utilize mindfulness as a strategy and understanding that smells and things around you are helpful. One of the approaches that we're using are peace corners.
A peace corner is like a place where you can just chill out. If I get like really frustrated and feel like I'm gonna yell, or when I feel really sad about to cry, I go to the peace corner.
It's a proactive approach. And so many times we give kids strategies, but we don't give them a time or a place to practice those strategies. We've really put a lot of effort in building positive relationships. Under that, there are strategies, and one of them is our check-in and check-out system.
Hey, Mariah.
Hi.
You ready to have another great day today?
Yep.
My check-in, check-out buddy, her name is Mariah, and she's in 4th grade. She comes to see me at the beginning and the end of every day. What are your goals for today?
Listen, be on task, and nice.
Awesome. She has 3 goals every day that she works on. She can get 0, 1, or 2 points for each of her goals.
And then at the end of the day, they know where they are. How was your day?
Good. Actually, it was fantastic.
Fantastic.
People will see a point sheet, but the most motivating piece of our check-in and check-out system is the mentor-mentee relationship.
You go to him, and then he asks about your day, and if you had a problem somewhere, we'll talk about that and see how you can fix it.
The child knows every day they come in this building that somebody's excited to see them in the morning and excited to see them right before they leave.
So do you think you knocked it out of the park? That's what I'm talking about.
And it's that positive in, positive out mindset.
You did it with me.
That's right. No, but you did it on your own. That's you, my man. Nice work.
That's been a huge success. Last year was a tough year. It was really tough. We didn't have the support systems fully in place that we have now. I didn't support teachers in the way that I should have and could have because I was a new principal, and I just didn't know how. But that all changed at the end of the year when we all just as a team sat down and said, we've got to do something different. Our paradigm has to shift, where we're talking about not only how to support students, but how to support yourself, self-care.
We know you can't help others until you help yourself. Sometimes this job is hard, this job is exhausting. Sometimes you just need a minute. Tap in, tap out is something that we've developed. You can text someone and be like, hey, can you cover my class? Can you give me a second? And we will gladly cover one another. You sometimes just need to ask for help. And it's okay. And it's really accepted here and it's promoted.
This is great.
Operating a trauma-informed approach is a blanketed approach for all kids.
You all have done outstanding work.
We have to be able to help them manage their experiences in productive ways.
What's your favorite on there?
It's not compliance-driven, it's a we've got your back approach.
And so I'd just like to mention, one of the things that they mention in the video is about the importance of relationships and the relationships piece. And Dr. Jones and I, for longer presentations, we have quite a bit that we talk about as to how to build those relationships in schools and get staff to come around and kind of viewing things a little differently. But one of our former students in our principal preparation program, when he was named a new principal, he was going to a really tough school, really tough K-8 school. And what he did, we kind of strategized a little bit, and because he came back to us, he had a relationship with us. And so we said, all right, let's think through some of the problems here. And what it came coming back to was building relationships. They had a shift in their demographics at the school, and the teachers and the students maybe just weren't connecting, and especially with the parents. And so what we ended up doing was, he said, all right, for the first 2 days of the school year, no instruction. We're not gonna do anything instructionally related. We just want to focus on building relationships, icebreakers, taking time to try and get to know our students, have them get to know us so that they will listen to us, they will trust us. And so that hopefully that'll make things smoother as the rest of the school year goes on. And I can tell you the results there were phenomenal. They should not have improved as much as they did. And consistently, everyone went back to how they started the school year, how much of a difference that made. Sorry, Dr. Jones, I'll hand it back to you.
No, and I wanted to just say also, thinking about the video, that was an elementary school, but how could these strategies work in a middle school or a high school? We know that you have students who need to check in, check out, and maybe they don't want a point sheet with a folder with stickers, although you do have some high school kids who like them some stickers, so don't discount that. But just thinking about how could you adapt some of these strategies, the tap in, tap out for the adults, letting adults take a break. So now, what does this look like returning to school after COVID-19, after being gone for an extended period? What might this look like? So we want to just talk about sources of traumatic stress next, and stressors related to the pandemic. So toxic stress that hinders learning and long-term outcomes or not from a one-off trauma, but from deep ongoing instability. So that's on the next slide, Dr. Lewis. So thinking about how health, food instability, social isolation, unstable home environment, and connection to protests and violence related to racism, how all of these things are impacting your students. And thinking about, I just want to also mention with the connection to protests and violence related to racism, there are more things popping up on TikTok before they make it to mainstream news. Your students are seeing things before we're seeing things. I know, for example, there was an incident last week with an African-American student, a young man in his neighborhood doing ROTC drills, and the police were called on him. That was on TikTok hours before it made any news sources. So your students are seeing these things before you're seeing these things, unless you're on TikTok a lot, which I'm not at all. But so these things and the protests and the violence that's happening, they're making social media faster than they're making mainstream media. So your students are seeing things and hearing things before we even know to address them. And this is impacting them because it's students that look like them, that sound like them. It's family members, it's friends, it's aunts, it's uncles, it's people that look like people that they are and that they know. And so it affects them in a much different way than we have time to go into right now. But thinking about that is an ongoing stressor for a lot of students. Thinking about, can I take a walk in my neighborhood? Or is someone going to call the cops on me like they did to that other kid who looked just like me and was my age? So how you can help is staff training on trauma sensitivity instruction. Plan daily connections with students to understand their individual stressors. Are you doing daily check-ins, whether it's with morning meetings, doing the color thing like we did at the beginning, a simple color check-in? You could have students, have a number scale, 1 to 5, how are you feeling today, and have them put up the fingers. Although if you work with middle school kids, you may have to tell them which fingers to put up. Just saying. But thinking about how you can also involve local health, housing, social service agencies for mental health and basic supports for students and their families. And review discipline policies that may leave students and families of color feeling targeted. And we mentioned this earlier. Are certain students always getting in trouble for disrespect or insubordination? Then maybe there's a policy issue or an implicit bias issue. Again, those are more things than we have time to talk about today, but there are sources of traumatic stress that are going on right now for all your students. And on the next slide, CASEL, if you're familiar with SEL, CASEL, the organization, they've come up with 4 steps of how you might address this for students and staff coming back into the building. Create a foundation for social emotional learning. And so some of you already have that in place. You have different curriculums, you have different things you're already doing. Attend to well-being and mutual supports for adults. CASEL, the student SEL framework, says, are you looking at adults? Promote social and emotional learning for students and reflect on how things are going and adjust as you learn. So this is from the CASEL website, but thinking about what well-being and supports are in place for the adults in your building. Number 2, how are you checking in and checking out with adults? How are you making sure that they're okay? You have adults in the building who've lost loved ones to COVID. Who may have had food instability themselves, who may have had housing instability, may have had people move in with them because of other family members having housing instability. Do you know what's going on with the adults in your building? Do you know what their story is? And so thinking about, on the next slide, how can you support staff in returning to school is, one, as an administrator, make sure you're ensuring the physical safety of students and staff. So this is very much, you're 6 feet apart or whatever number of feet apart we're supposed to be now, because I think that's changing. But, are people wearing their masks consistently? Is hand washing going on? Is sanitizing happening? Physical safety is thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and sort of placing that in this realm. Physical safety is something you have to make sure that if students and staff don't feel that you're physically trying to keep them safe from getting sick, they're not going to be able to pay attention to other things. But check in with staff collectively and individually. You may notice if you do the color check-in like we did at the beginning, you had some teachers who were blue or yellow. Well, maybe you need to check in with them individually, have a one-on-one conversation with them, have someone on your staff, a counselor or a social worker, have an individual conversation with them and see what's going on? How can we support them in that? Are you offering PD sessions on wellness and dealing with stress? Again, thinking about the adults, because if the adults in your building aren't in a good place, they can't support students. And if they don't have a trauma sensitive mindset, they're going to perpetuate and make things worse for the students. Validate staff member concerns and create opportunities for staff to connect. So what does that look like? If all you're doing is going into business meetings about protocols, that's not going to help them feel connected. Are you giving them chances to have small conversations? Are you giving them chances to check in emotionally, socially, talk about things they're hopeful for, something fun that happened over the weekend, something they're looking forward to? How are you helping them connect with each other in different ways? And you can do it virtually. You can have virtual check-ins and have people put things in the chat box if you don't have time to have everyone share out. Think about doing, your morning meeting circles virtually, what that might look like for adults in your department meetings and your PLC meetings, your grade level team meetings, but you have to give them chances to connect. And so next is just a resource. Dr. Lewis, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Sure. So DPI, I'm sure many of you are familiar with their SEO and crisis response resources that they put together. They've done a really great job in that regard. if you, for whatever reason, have missed this along the way, can take a look, take advantage. There's some really great tools that are available to us right there as employees of our public school system. So take a look at that, along with the CASEL resource that Dr. Jones was mentioning earlier. Just wonderful resources that we have readily available at no cost.
So hopefully you can think about all the things we've talked about, teaching resilient strategies for students and adults, and what that can look like as you're coming back into your building, as you're transitioning back into buildings, as you're transitioning into summer school, as you're transitioning into the fall. And again, with summer programs, I know summer programs are coming and there's a lot of academic focus, but if students don't feel emotionally safe, then they're not ready to learn. So how are you weaving check-in meetings to your summer school program? How are you doing, social emotional check-ins and thinking about those things? So we are running to the end of our time, and we want to make sure there's time for questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. But here's our contact information. And there were some things in the chat earlier. We are happy to share the PowerPoint. The video is embedded in the PowerPoint. Some of you were wanting to share that video. We are happy to share that. I think it's going to be sent out to all participants afterwards. But here's our contact information, and reach out to us. We are happy to have conversations with you, to talk with administrators, to talk with staff. We're here to support you because we want to do what's best for kids, and what's best for kids sometimes means doing what's best for adults first. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both for just an excellent session. I know I'm speaking for all the attendees this morning when I say I feel uplifted, and I feel that you've shared a lot of great resources and guidance, and it's so well timed with where we are in the point of our students coming back to our schools, our school buildings. So I hope you all can take this back to your school district and your individual school building and build on what you've heard today. We want to pause here now and hear from our second partner who made this session possible today. So I'm going to recognize Jennifer Hart of Dreambox Learning. Jennifer, thank you for being with us, and thank you for the support you provide our administrators and our school districts.
Absolutely. Now remember, there's a Q&A after me, so don't hop off now. Stay on. They're ready to answer those questions. I just wanted to take a moment and say, you were talking about summer bridge programs and attacking that learning loss. And when we talk about trauma and students of trauma, we really talk a lot about should. I should. People should all over themselves. I should have known this content. I shouldn't get upset that I don't know it. I shouldn't be behind. And that's a very frustrating point for students. It's really important that programs allow students to have choice, allow students, give them permission to play, right? Students learn best in a gamified environment, and that's really important to think of it through the student's eyes. So as you're attacking learning recovery this summer, I wanted to show you some data from districts. I have their email permission and verbal permission to show you this data. Districts right here in North Carolina who have attacked summer learning loss, whether it's 4 weeks or 6 weeks. So this is Allegheny County up in the mountains. We're looking at 1 month from February to March, the growth and points that you can have. Where you really want to focus on right here, this is where this should be around 50%, right? And these are your bubble kids. So when we're getting close to that 50% mark, let's go to the next one, please. You can see this is Currituck on the east coast of North Carolina, well above that 50%. And look how many points they grew just in 1 month. Because when you're looking at a bridge program, if we could go to the next one, you need to know that you're going to get growth in that 4 weeks. Now, this is just with 5 lessons a week. And in summer school, you typically use 10 to 13 lessons a week. So you can expect double this. If we can go to the next one. And Burke County is really knocking it out of the ballpark right now. This is what it's predicted they're going to be on their end of grade assessment. Well over 60% proficient students on their EOG. And so when you are looking at a summer program and you need to make sure that that learning loss is your time spent and utilized is going to be worth your time, you want to make sure you've got a program that has third-party efficacy that's going to give that. And it's going to give students permission to work on any grade level of content and not feel bad about it. Your peers don't know which environment you're working in. Your environment looks like your peers, the content's different. Just solidifying that confidence to work in the environment. If you want to learn more about it, the QR code will take you to our North Carolina landing page, but you've got my cell number there as well. Feel free to reach out. Thank you so much. You guys, Dr. Jones, Dr. Lewis, this is, as an educator, the most passionate portion of my time in school. I fought for SEL constantly. Thank you for bringing this to the forefront. It is so important. You guys rock.
Absolutely, they do. Thank you, Jennifer, and you guys at Dreambox rock as well. So thank you for your support. So we're going to go now to a couple of questions that I think we see coming in the chat, the Q&A box. And remember, if you have others, you can drop those in. We have a few more minutes and have plenty of time to address questions you might have. So I'll just read these out to our presenters. First, we see from Melanie Smith. What is the cost of a Leader in Me program in an elementary school, if you know that?
I do not know that offhand. Do you know, Dr. Lewis? Sorry, I don't know, but I do know some schools that are using it. So if you want to message me with my email address, I can help you make some connections to some schools in North Carolina that are using the program. They may be a resource to you.
And
I think there's a few.
I'm sorry, there may be some attendees who are listening in who are using the program and know that, and you could drop that in the chat box if you're aware of the cost. That would help your colleagues.
I saw a couple people mention how great a program it is for them. So yeah, if you can help your colleagues out, that'd be great.
Okay, and the next question from Patricia Durham, can you put the NCDPI page for resources in the chat?
And I think Dr. Lewis is doing that right now. He's putting it, are you putting it in the Q&A box or in the chat box?
Q&A box.
Okay.
So look in the Q&A box for that. We can also post it with the resources from this webinar. We'll put a link to that on the resources that you will be receiving in follow-up to today's session. So again, you will get the presentation from Dr. Jones and Dr. Lewis, which has the video embedded in it. So you'll have that. And we may also be making a recording of this session today available. We think it was really good and would really like to spread the reach of it to some other folks who couldn't log on this morning. And that way you have something that you can share with colleagues who you think need to see this as well. So appreciate the support from our presenters in making that possible. Something I failed to mention earlier is that East Carolina University School of Education was NCASA's first partner in higher education. So you guys have just been phenomenal to work with and helping to support our school leaders, our school instructional support personnel, and certainly the information you've shared today has just been outstanding and very helpful and beneficial. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box right now. See something here from Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you want to chime in with that question?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I don't want to drag it out, but I did have a question and I noticed no one else was asking it. There's been some legislation filed in the past couple of years that would actually require districts to test for ACEs, much like we do for, like eye services, and some schools even do like dental programs. But there's been a little bit of controversy with districts actually, testing students and some of the liability that comes with that. So I just wanted to know, what are y'all's thoughts on mandatory testing for ACEs?
So Dr. Jones, I'll chime in and look, others may have a different perspective of this. We have students, some of whom are listening right now, who wanted at one point or another to test their students for ACEs and to see what effect that had. And one of the cautions I have with that is, okay, what is that really going to tell you? Most of you know your students have adverse childhood experiences. So if we're creating a trauma-sensitive or trauma-skilled school, we're providing that support for all of our students, regardless of whether they have 6 ACEs or they have no ACEs. And so it's just the right approach broadly. And so that we catch every student who has experienced adverse childhood experiences, we're providing with that support without labeling or stigmatizing anyone in any sort of way, shape, or form. I would be really concerned about what would come of that data. Also, there's a study that I'll be conducting, and some of you may get some information about that as we kind of roll it out later this summer into the fall. Not all ACEs are the same, right? They're not one-to-one. You can't tell me that even the very worst divorce is as bad as sexual abuse, right? And so when we say one-to-one, all right, this student has one ACE, this student has one ACE. Well, there's a lot of subjectivity there. And so this particular study is going to be reaching out to our educators throughout the state and also in the state of Missouri to find out, look, based on your experiences, which types of trauma seem to have the most significant impact on student performance in schools. And so that way we can tackle this kind of on a broader level rather than trying to drill down and identify, well, this kid has 5 ACEs, this kid has 1. And so we're going to create some sort of specific plan for them, when in reality, what that looks like is we're going to create a trauma sensitive and trauma skilled school across the board. Just my thoughts.
And I agree that I think it's a slippery slope. Like, what happens with that data? Who uses the data? And are the people collecting the data skilled and educated enough to know what to do with it? Or does it become data that we use to stigmatize kids who already have enough things going on in their lives? So I worry about who would be doing the data collection and what would come of that data afterwards.
Right, because as you guys know, we don't really have sufficient staffing in most schools for, counselors and nurses and that sort of thing. So if we're asking teachers to put something else on their plate, that can run into some trouble as well. So thank you guys for answering that.
And just one other thing when talking about ACEs, sometimes for some kids, they don't realize that it was a trauma. And so now we're telling them, they're like, hey, by the way, your parents getting divorced traumatized you. Did you know that? Because again, thinking of the roller coaster, everyone reacts differently to different situations. And it may not have been pleasant, but it may not have been, again, as traumatic as some other events were. And also, if people are asking these questions, do they have the skills to deal with emotions that are stirred up when these questions are asked?
And the capacity also to deal with, imagine if we're receiving all of this feedback about sexual abuse or physical abuse. And then what do our social workers do with that information? What's our responsibility there, our legal obligation in that sense? It seems like Pandora's box, when instead our approach could be more of a trauma sensitive, trauma skilled approach.
Very good points. Thank you, guys.
Excellent discussion. And as Elizabeth mentioned, it makes me think we certainly do not have enough counselors, social workers, psychologists, and nurses in our schools. And that is something that we here at NCASA are advocating that our General Assembly increase when they put our state budget together this year, because we know students need you now more than ever. So that is one of our priorities that we're working on. And we know that is very much supported by our school leader members. So hoping to see positive things at the end of the summer when that budget comes together.
Catherine, I'm thrilled to hear that. I'm really pleased with NCASA, your approach with supporting our student services staff. I just can't say enough about how much that support means.
We're all in this together, and it takes all of us to do what's needed for our students to help them succeed. And so that's one of our main focuses here. So I think that is the end of our questions. We're going to wrap it up here because we know you have other places to be and things to do today. We do thank you for joining us. We wanted to make you aware of a couple of the other sessions we have coming up in this free series. Our next one will be on May 3rd, and we're going to be focusing on revamping student literacy and early childhood learning. And we have the whole new law that was just recently signed, Senate Bill 387, which was the Excellent Public Schools Act of 2021, that revamps our Read to Achieve program with the science of reading and all the training and support that has to be put in place, and what are the requirements for our school districts as you start to tackle those new pieces of that legislation so that you can be in compliance. The one after that will be a time to check in on what policy issues have survived the crossover deadline in the General Assembly, which is May 7th. That session will be May 17th. The crossover deadline is May 13th. So everything that has not crossed over from the first chamber to the second by that point of the General Assembly. If it deals only with policy and not funding or a limited number of other issues that it could impact, but mainly policy bills, have to move from one chamber to the other to stay alive. So what's in, what's out, and which could possibly even reemerge if they didn't make that deadline. So that's something that Elizabeth and I will be doing for you on May 17th. We hope you'll join us for one or both of those, as well as others that are coming up in the series later this summer as we roll into June, July, and August. So without further ado, we're going to wrap it up this morning, and just know that your team here at NCASA is here to support you. We're pleased to bring you services like this free webinar series, as well as the communications that we do to try to keep you up to date on what news is happening that you need to know. And we're also daily advocating on your behalf. So we have that focus of what is best for our students and how do we best equip our members to provide the supports and an outstanding learning environment for every student in the state, no matter where they live. That is something we'll continue to do each and every day. If you need to reach us, you have our contact information here. Look on the website shortly after this webinar. Within the next few days, we'll be getting the recording posted, as well as the PowerPoint, the video that the professor shared today. And we'll put that link to the DPI resources that many of you ask us to include. And again, be sure and fill out your evaluation that you'll get in your email, because if you want a CEU credit for this, then you will need to do that evaluation, which does help us better put these events together in the future, so you're getting the information you need. Enjoy this week. Thanks for all you're doing to support our students, and we hope to see you again on a webinar or even in person very soon. And thanks again to our presenters and our partners. Have a wonderful rest of your day.